Greetings, this is Greg. As it says in the title, this is part 2, so if you didn't already watch part 1, this video probably isn't a good place to start. The P-47 has a reputation for being one of, if not the fastest diving propeller planes in World War II. This is a bit of a tricky claim to make as there are different diving parameters, and a plane can be better in one and not another. Some of these diving parameters are the rate at which the plane can nose over into the dive, the maximum dive airspeed, the maximum Mach number, the steepest nose-down pitch angle the plane can sustain without exceeding other limits, controllability in the dive, and rates of acceleration when diving. No one airplane from World War II is superior in every single one of these categories and at every altitude. But overall, the P-47 does very well in dives and can be reasonably called the best diving propeller airplane to see combat in World War II. Let's begin by looking at the often mentioned issue that hindered the early British fighters. The early Spitfires with their carburetors were famous for having their engines quit if the nose was shoved down too aggressively. This was by no means a fatal flaw, but it was a disadvantage that their German adversaries could exploit. The P-47 does not have this issue. No matter how fast you shove the nose over, the engine won't quit. This is because the P-47 has fuel injection. This is confusing because the injection device is called the Stromberg injection carburetor. However, it's a carburetor in name only. It's actually what would later be called throttle body fuel injection. The term throttle body fuel injection hadn't come into use yet, but that's what it is. Throttle body injection means that instead of having an injector for each cylinder, one or two very large injectors are placed just after the throttle. It's not as advanced as the fuel injection system the Germans were using. Those systems had individual injectors for each cylinder, but the P-47's throttle body type injection was a lot more advanced than any float type carburetor, and a lot better. In addition to having better mixture control, which was largely automated, it didn't have any negative G issues. Thus, the P-47 could be aggressively slammed into a dive. Next, we have to discuss maximum indicated airspeed attainable in a dive. This is a critical specification, and we're going to go over it in great detail. Indicated airspeed is simply what's read right off the airspeed indicator seen here at position 3. The pilot flies the airplane based on indicated airspeeds. In other words, stall speeds, flap, landing gear, and maximum speed limitations are almost always in relation to indicated airspeed. The gauge does have some minor errors due to its mechanism, which lead us to the next type of airspeed that we need to know, which is calibrated airspeed. Calibrated airspeed is simply indicated airspeed corrected for instrument error. It's a small error, but in the case of the P-47, it's a little bigger than most other airplanes, about 5 miles per hour at lower speeds and about 20 miles per hour at very high speeds. You'll see later why this is going to matter. Now, the next type of airspeed is very important to understand for flight at higher altitudes, especially in reference to navigation. It's true airspeed. True airspeed is the plane's actual speed through the air, which at high altitudes will be greater than indicated airspeed. So let's explain why that is. The airspeed indicator is really just displaying a measurement of ram air pressure into the pitot tube. It does this by comparing ram air pressure in the pitot tube with ambient pressure from a static port. Nearly every airplane from the 1930s until today has this same basic airspeed indicator system. The only exception I know of is the B-2 bomber, which doesn't have pitot tubes. It uses some sort of super advanced black magic for its airspeed indication. Ironically, this was actually a factor in the one and only B-2 crash. Back to normal airplanes, the pitot-static type airspeed indicators are calibrated so that at sea level, indicated and true airspeeds, or the plane's actual speed through the air, are nearly identical. At high altitudes, and this is where it gets just a little bit tricky, but follow me on this. At high altitudes, the air is thinner. Thus, a given true airspeed will result in a lower indicated airspeed since there's less air ramming into the pitot tube. For example, at sea level, 300 miles per hour indicated would be pretty close to 300 miles per hour through the air, or 300 miles per hour of true airspeed. However, at high altitude, 300 miles per hour indicated could be much higher, about 400 miles per hour or more of true airspeed. This might seem like it would be very confusing to the pilot, but it simply isn't. The plane only knows indicated airspeed, since that's really an indication of the actual amount of air flowing over the wings, and the air loads on the plane. As an example, the maximum allowable speed in the P-47D with the landing gear down is 250 miles per hour indicated. More than that's too much stress on the gears, probably the gear doors actually. It doesn't matter if the plane's true airspeed is 250 miles per hour at sea level or 300 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. The actual air load on the gear is the same either way, since in both cases the indicated airspeed will be about 250. Stall speeds work the same way. With the gear and flaps up, the P-47D stalls at 115 miles per hour indicated, regardless of altitude, although at higher altitudes, the actual true airspeed will be higher. So, how much of an air load could the P-47 take? Or in other words, just how fast could it go in a dive before something goes wrong? Let's start by looking at the limitations for 10,000 feet of altitude and below. The maximum number from the P-47D manual, the US variant, is 500 miles per hour of indicated airspeed. That's really fast, as we'll see in the comparisons later. So why is it limited to 500 miles per hour? What happens if you go faster? Well, some early P-47s were having structural failures in the tail at high speeds, reportedly below 500 miles per hour. There were some doubts about the accuracy of the pilot reports, i.e., some thought the pilots were overspeeding the plane and then lying about it. So, NACA tackled this and figured out that the pilots were correct. Under some conditions, the fabric-covered tails could start to shred material at only 460 miles per hour, which is still fast, but well short of the plane's rated 500 mile per hour limit. NACA fixed the problem with an all-metal rudder and reinforced vertical stabilizer, which were then tested and found satisfactory to speeds in excess of 600 miles per hour. Well, scratch that last part. Tested to a true airspeed of 600 miles per hour in excess of 500 miles per hour. Now, I can't pin down exactly when the improved tail showed up, but it was available in September of 1942, and documents show it was in use in April of 1943, so it was sometime between those two dates. Every single picture I've found of a P-47 in the European theater shows the metal rudder, so I don't think that the earlier fail-prone tail was ever a factor in combat over Europe. So with the tail fixed, what's the next problem? In other words, what's going to break if we exceed 500 miles per hour in our P-47D? Well, it turns out the next P-47 isn't something that breaks. The P-47 is immensely strong and it just doesn't tend to break. In NACA testing, they found that as with all airplanes, at higher and higher speeds, the ailerons became less and less effective. And in the P-47, at 545 miles per hour indicated, something really bad happens. Aileron reversal. In this case, it's caused by the wings flexing in such a way that the shape of the wing deforms, causing the plane to roll in the opposite direction of the control input. In this situation, the ailerons essentially become trim tabs for a wing warping system. In other words, when the pilot would move the control stick to the left, the ailerons would cause the wings to twist and the plane would roll to the right. In order to stay safely away from aileron reversal, speed was limited to 500 miles per hour in the flight manual. It's worth mentioning that the British tested the P-47 to 520 miles per hour and apparently considered that to be a good speed limitation. I guess they were just more comfy getting close to that 545 mile an hour point. Now, the later models of the P-47, meaning the M and N, which I shall refer to as Mike and November models, had improved wings and thus an increased maximum dive speed at very low altitudes of 564 miles per hour. Before we start looking at the diving speeds at higher altitudes, it's time for some comparisons. Below 10,000 feet, the P-47 is simply the fastest diving propeller airplane of the war. Let's take a look at this chart. These numbers are the maximum indicated airspeeds at sea level, taken right out of the various flight manuals. They don't tell the whole story, but they're a good indication of dive performance at lower altitudes, generally below 10,000 feet. The problem with this chart is that different airplanes have different errors in their airspeed indicators. Remember, we talked about the difference between indicated and calibrated. Some read too high, some too low, some are about dead on. In order to see how the planes really compare to each other, we need to look at the calibrated airspeed numbers. But that creates some problems, which I'll discuss here one by one. So let's add in the calibrated airspeed data, or at least the best numbers I can come up with. Let's start with the P-47D. It has a chart in the pilot's manual, but as with all other calibration charts for these planes, it doesn't go up to 500 miles per hour. So I simply use the correction seen at the high end of the chart, and as a percentage, to come up with an estimated calibrated airspeed of 520. I'm confident that's in the ballpark. Now look at the P-40 Warhawk. It can really dive, but I found no indication for airspeed indicator corrections, which makes me think that the airspeed indicator errors were so minor in this airplane that they're not significant. The whole point of flight manuals including this data is for navigation. Calibrated airspeed numbers are needed to estimate times of arrival at waypoints. So the fact that the numbers are not in the manual usually indicates that the gauge is already pretty close and somebody felt that corrections were not needed. The P-51 speed here is 509 miles per hour calibrated, so it's really fast, but it's not quite as fast as any P-47 variant. A lot of people think that the P-51 is slightly faster in a dive at low altitude than the 47D, but they're failing to factor in calibrated airspeed. The P-51 is very close, but not quite there. The Spitfire data is for the Mark 9 and Mark 16, which are almost identical airplanes. The Mark 16 has, of course, the Packard Merlin engine, much like a P-51, but optimized for lower altitudes. A lot of the Mark 16s also had clipped wings. The manuals for these planes make no mention of calibrated airspeed, so for now, I'm assuming that the Spitfire's gauge, at least for these models, was very accurate. Now there's very good data on all of this for the FW-190, and its airspeed calibration numbers are pretty close to the P-47's. So in terms of calibrated airspeed, the 190A models could reach 478 miles per hour. The Hellcat's airspeed indicator actually reads high, thus its calibrated airspeed numbers are lower than indicated. It's a little bit unusual. The P-47 Mach and November calibrated airspeed numbers are a bit of a problem. There's no data in the manual for this, but there isn't any data in the manual for takeoff and landing distance either. It's as if the 47 November manual was either a supplement or all the charted data is somewhere else. But since it has a similar pitot-static system to the D model, I just used the same correction factors. But it's possible that's a mistake, but it's the best I could come up with. Below 10,000 feet, the P-47 was the fastest diving propeller plane in the sky over Europe, period. More importantly, pilots could dive it at those speeds with confidence. Excluding early aircraft with the fabric tails, which were later fixed, I couldn't find a single case of a P-47 structural failure in flight at high speed. Not one, not even with battle damage. I supposed it must have happened at some point, but it was certainly rare. That's not the case with some of the other airplanes here. Spitfires and 109s suffered from in-flight breakups at what I consider to be a pretty alarming rate. There are cases of P-51s breaking up in flight, but they're relatively rare. The P-40 and Hellcats, like the P-47, seem to almost never break up. Next, we need to start looking at the limitations at higher altitudes. This is much more complex. Up until the 1930s, dive speeds were only limited by indicated airspeed. In other words, if a plane had a limitation of 230 miles per hour, its limit was 230, whether it was at sea level or at 20,000 feet. But with the advent of newer and faster planes in the 1930s, something changed. New planes like the P-38 Lightning were able to achieve higher speeds and at higher altitudes than were possible just a few years earlier. And soon, the problem of Mach number limitations became apparent. The Mach number is the aircraft's true and not indicated airspeed as a percentage of the speed of sound. For example, Mach 0.80 is 80% of the speed of sound. The speed of sound varies with temperature, which means it usually gets slower with an increase in altitude. Now, I want to stress that the speed of sound is directly related to temperature, not altitude. Both the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge and the U.S. Navy's Aerodynamics for Naval Aviators make this clear. There is a question on the U.S. Commercial Pilot's License written test that gets a lot of people on this exact issue because it's a little bit tricky. The speed of sound varies with temperature, but temperature usually, but not always, varies with altitude. Normally, as your plane climbs, it gets colder. In the standard atmosphere, which is used for planning, there are specific temperatures for each altitude and a corresponding speed of sound. So in practical terms, as the plane climbs higher and higher, for a given airspeed, it gets closer and closer to its Mach number limitation. This becomes a factor in dives because diving is the only way a World War II fighter can go fast enough to reach its critical Mach number. When it does reach this number, the problem of compressibility comes up. At this point, controls become largely ineffective, thus it's very difficult or impossible to pull the plane out of the dive. I'm not going to go into just why this happens at this point, although I might make a video about it another time. For now, just know that as the plane reaches its critical Mach number, it becomes more or less uncontrollable, and thus the critical Mach number is an important limitation for World War II airplanes when diving. Let's look at some numbers to start making sense of all this. For now, we'll use the P-47D, which is identical to the B and C models in terms of diving limitations. Let's graph it on the NACA Mach chart. This is the actual chart that World War II pilots would have likely used, which is why it's the one we're using. Hopefully they had a better copy. I got this one off the NACA website. There actually are better ones out there, I found later. As a side note, I did double check my results with an online calculator, and the Mach number portion of the chart is in relationship to the standard atmosphere. That means that at colder than standard temperatures at a given altitude, your actual Mach number will be higher than on the chart. Since it's very important to avoid reaching critical Mach, the speed limitations based on the indicated airspeed in the standard atmosphere have to be on the conservative side. You might ask, well, why use this chart at all? Why reference indicated airspeed and altitude when using true airspeed and temperature would be much more accurate? Well, modern airplanes have Mach meters that in effect do just that. But in World War II, temperature gauges read falsely high at high airspeeds. So using a chart, memorizing speeds, and having altitude-based speed limitations on a placard in the airplane was really the best way, and that's what they did. They just used very conservative numbers on those placards. To understand this chart, let's look at their sample problem that NACA included. I added some color lines to make this a little easier. Follow the green line from the 360 mile per hour value at the bottom up to the blue line for 25,000 feet. From the intersection of those two lines, go straight across to the left and find the Mach number, which is 0.745. So at 360 miles per hour indicated, and the chart assumes indicated and calibrated are equal. So in this case, at 25,000 feet, the Mach number is 0.745. So hopefully you follow along there. Now that's all you really need to know, but in terms of Mach number, but let's finish off the chart explanation since we're already here. From the green-blue intersection, follow the chart lines diagonally down and to the right, staying between the two lines until you reach the true airspeed number. In this example, the true airspeed is 516 miles per hour. I put an orange dot there to help you. The last line, the purple one, allows us to calculate true airspeed for non-standard temperatures. Standard temperature at 25,000 feet is minus 30 Fahrenheit. Follow the purple line from our blue-green intersection over to the sea level line, then down to the actual temperature of 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really, really warm at this altitude. Go straight across to the right and get a true airspeed corrected for non-standard temperature of 540 miles per hour. Bonus round, take that 540 mile per hour number and see if you can determine our actual Mach number corrected for the non-standard temperature of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll put the answer in the description. At this point, if you can use and understand this chart, then you probably have a better understanding of Mach numbers and their relationship to airspeed than a lot of the commercial pilots I've flown with, so it's time to move on. Let's consider the P-47D's low altitude limit. Connect the line for the indicated airspeed of 500 miles per hour to the pressure altitude line of 10,000 feet. From there we go straight across to the left and we get a Mach number of 0.775, or 77.5% of the speed of sound. The speed of 520 miles per hour reached by the British would equal about 0.80 on this chart. However, we don't know the conditions of their test. Specifically, we don't know the temperature, but in the standard atmosphere, 520 would be Mach 0.80. The pilot's manual for the P-47 makes no mention of the maximum Mach number. Instead, it references airspeed numbers, which makes sense because the P-47 doesn't have a Mach meter. However, the 0.775 number for 500 miles per hour at 10,000 feet makes sense, as I've seen two NACA reports where they ran the plane to 0.78. I did a quick online search and found that quite a few people claim the P-47 was limited to Mach 0.68 or so, but that's clearly not true. The official manual and NACA reports dispute that. NACA even has reports on control forces required to maneuver the plane at Mach 0.70 and tests on aileron control at 7.6. We'll talk about Thunderbolt maneuverability in a later episode, but for now know that the Thunderbolt is quite maneuverable at high Mach numbers compared to its adversaries. It's one of its advantages. Now, let's look at what happens at 25,000 feet. This is pretty interesting. The U.S. Army Air Force's pilot's manual has a chart and it shows a maximum speed of 350 miles per hour, but a note says don't exceed 400 unless there's an emergency. The concern here is compressibility from getting too close to the critical Mach number. That 400 mile per hour number works out to Mach 0.82. That makes sense. It's straight out of the manual and it agrees with other data. For example, the British tested the plane to 450 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, which works out to Mach 0.836. Based on all of this, I'm very confident standing on the statement that the P-47D has a reasonable maximum Mach number of 0.82. That doesn't mean nobody ever went faster in one, but I'm interested in numbers that are verifiable with an official source and ideally multiple sources. And we have that for the 47D at Mach 0.82. We do have one more source for the P-47 November. In this book, which is a free download from the NASA site and well worth getting, you'll find the following statement. So I think that 0.82 number is rock solid. In the flight manuals, you'll find numbers for high altitude dives that have lower airspeed limits than would be seen at 0.82. They typically correspond to Mach 7.5 or 0.78. This is because they were trying to provide a safe buffer for acceleration and for variations from standard temperatures. The P-47's acceleration in a dive is incredible, thus a decent margin of safety was a good idea. That said, the numbers in the manuals are not exact Mach limitations. So let's tie all this together. Suppose we have a P-47 diving from just over 25,000 feet. Our pilot in this case has studied the NACA chart, he knows his plane, and has thought through this situation in advance, or perhaps he has his own notes on the dash. In any case, he knows how to get the maximum performance from his plane. And in our scenario, he's running from a pair of FW-190s, so he's going to need all the speed he can get. Knowing that the P-47 can hit Mach 0.82, he's going to nose down with full power on until his plane reaches 400 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. I put up a red line for the 0.82 limitation and another for the 500 mile per hour indicated limit. The arrow shows our 400 mile per hour limit. The pilot knows he can maintain Mach 0.82 during a large portion of the dive. To do this, indicated speed will have to increase as the plane descends. So at 20,000 feet, Mach 0.82 is about 440 miles per hour, and at 15,000, about 490. At about 13,000 feet, it's going to hit its 500 mile per hour limit. At this point, it should be clear that below 13,000 feet in the P-47, indicated airspeed is the limitation, not Mach number. Above that altitude, the limitation is the Mach number. This relationship is different from one plane to another. The changeover point is not always going to be 13,000, as we'll see later. I want to mention the dive angle issue here. In the previous example, our heroic, freedom-loving pilot would have started that dive from cruise flight by adding full power and lowering the nose. He would have lowered it a lot to accelerate away from danger as fast as possible. However, once the plane reaches point 82, he'd have a decision to make. Should he reduce power and steepen the dive angle to maintain the Mach number, or leave the power up and dive at the same speed but at a more shallow angle? Well, the answer, of course, is entirely dependent on the tactical situation. In most cases, he'd probably leave the power up and take the shallow angle to gain more lateral separation, and to make the dive recovery less nerve-wracking. However, there may be cases where he needs to take advantage of the P-47's ability to sustain a dive at a very steep angle. The P-47 is very chubby, and at a given airspeed, it can sustain a steeper dive than any German fighter. We know this because it requires more power to cruise at a given speed, thus has more drag, largely just because it's bigger. What that means is that at, say, 480 indicated, with the engine at idle, it can keep its nose down farther than the pursuing aircraft. This will force the enemy pilot to choose between overspeeding and risking structural failure, or pulling up and taking his gun sights off the target. Of course, this advantage won't last, as the ground will come up quickly, so it would only be used very briefly. How about other World War II fighters? How fast could they dive from high altitude? Well, this is a video about the P-47, so my level of research on the other planes is lower. However, all of these numbers are from official sources. In every case, it's either the pilot's manual, official placards in the plane, or in the case of the 109G, technical orders from Berlin. The Mach limit I have for the 109G is 0.725, which is really low. It's possible they were running them at 0.75 for certain portions of the war, but the only verifiable number I have for the 109G is 725. The FW-190 clocks in with a limit of 0.79. It's identical to the P-51 within a few thousandths of a Mach, which is nothing. I've seen Mach numbers for the 190 of 0.75, but I think they failed to calculate in the extra 12 miles per hour for the airspeed indicator error. In other words, I corrected the placarded 360 mile an hour limit at 26,525 feet for the 12 mile per hour error, and I get 0.79. The Spitfire does really well here with a published number of Mach 0.85. That number is right out of the Spitfire Mark 9 manual. I could even make an argument for 0.87, but the evidence for that is weak. Let's convert all these Mach numbers to actual true airspeeds at 25,000 feet and see where we are in practical terms. I'll assume we start the dive above 25,000 so we can be at our Mach limit in each airplane when reaching 25,000. In this scenario, all the planes will be going to full power, and the P-47 will easily out-accelerate all of them except the P-51, which will be very close. I'll cover this in the maneuverability chapter, but the 47 out-accelerates essentially everything in a dive from high altitude. When they reach 25,000 feet, the Spitfire is clearly the fastest. It may also be the closest to falling apart, but based on published numbers, the Spitfire is the fastest plane here in a high-altitude dive. In this scenario, the Spitfire's edge over the P-47 will be short-lived. As the planes descend, they will reach a point where the speed of sound will increase enough so that maximum Mach number won't be a limitation, and indicated airspeed rather than Mach number will be the limit. Remember, in the P-47, that doesn't happen until 13,000 feet. In the Spitfire, it happens at 23,000 feet. So the Spit's advantage due to Mach number is very short-lived in this scenario, and once the planes are below 20,000 feet, the Spitfire starts to fall behind the P-47. At the beginning of this video, I made the claim that the P-47 is the best diving propeller airplane of World War II, at least the best diving one to see combat. It is the best in nearly every relevant category. Its dive speed is the fastest below 20,000 feet. It's the second fastest above 20,000. It can dive at the steepest angle, and it can beat or exceed any other airplane in dive acceleration and maneuverability, both of which we'll discuss when we discuss P-47 maneuverability in another chapter. It's also worth noting again that the P-47s really held together, and there are few, if any, reports of P-47 structural failures resulting from dive speeds, with the exceptions that we've already discussed. Let's talk for a moment about compressibility. When a plane exceeds its critical Mach number and enters compressibility, it becomes largely uncontrollable. It's essentially a lawn dart at this point. The problem is that the controls lose effectiveness, and to regain control, you need to get the plane back under the critical Mach number. Thankfully, that tends to happen as the plane descends because the speed of sound goes up, thus the Mach number decreases. Thus, with no input from the pilot, the plane may come back under control. In the P-47, to recover from compressibility, the following procedures are suggested right out of the manual. Apply strong back pressure on the stick, but don't use the trim. The trim won't help during compressibility, and when the plane comes out, it can come out suddenly, and a mistrimmed airplane will react violently at these speeds and possibly kill you. I want to add that there are other manuals that do suggest using the trim. It's just a question of how ready you are when the controls take effect. Next suggestion, keep the ailerons neutral. There's a danger of aileron reversal, so you can just avoid that issue entirely by not using them. Keep the ball and the inclinometer in the center and set neutral rudder trim. We don't want to side load the vertical stabilizer at these speeds. Increase power. That may sound odd, but an increase in power will help bring the nose up in this airplane. At this point, a nose down attitude will result in a greater speed increase than power. Watch your manifold pressure. All that extra ram air makes it easier than normal to exceed your manifold pressure limits, and we don't want an engine failure at this moment. Wait for lower altitude and pray. Or, even better, you could fly a P-47 D-30 or later, which has compressibility recovery flaps. These are essentially dive brakes which will aid in recovery. There are two flaps, one under each wing, operated by an in-cockpit switch labeled up or down. There isn't much information out there on these, but apparently they were effective enough to allow recovery from compressibility without requiring descent to lower altitudes. In other words, they speed braked their way into effectiveness. This sounds great, and it is great, but the D-30 was a pretty late variant, and they went to the November models soon after that. The Novembers didn't have this feature because they needed to make room for more fuel to escort B-29s. I want to add that there are rumors of various World War II fighters exceeding Mach 1. I don't think any of them are true. None of the claims are credible. That doesn't mean that I think that any specific person was lying. It's usually a question of instrumentation, hypoxia, or some other factor. There's no actual test data to support the story that a World War II fighter exceeded the speed of sound, and I do think that if I was going to try and get as close as I could to Mach 1 in a World War II fighter, I would choose the P-47 with dive recovery flaps. At least I know the tail's good to 600 miles an hour. And with the dive recovery flaps and the later wing, meaning it would have to be a P-47M or Mach variant, I think that I'd have a good chance of getting up near, into the high 8s and probably surviving. That's all for this episode. Part 3 is coming soon. May already be up, depending on when you're watching this, I suppose. Please subscribe, and if you want to help support this channel, check out my Patreon. Details are in the description. Until next time, bye for now. Wait, one more thing. Based on some comments I've seen in other videos, it appears that some have the impression that being a pilot is really math intensive, and I can understand why some might think that. In fact, this video may even contribute to that school of thought. But it's really not that math intensive, at least not in the way you might think. It's important for pilots to understand certain mathematical relationships, like the fact that an increase in altitude causes an increase in true airspeed relative to indicated airspeed. But no pilots I know of work that out as a pencil and paper math problem. In the World War II era and well into the space age, these computations were made by pilots with the E-6B flight computer, which is essentially an aviation-specific circular slide rule. It was created in the 1930s by a naval lieutenant, and for decades was the device used by pilots to calculate things like true airspeed, time, speed, and distance problems, wind correction angles, and more. There are many variants of the E-6B, but they're all essentially the same. These were standard issue for U.S. World War II pilots, and all were trained to use them. In fact, all pilots from all nations were trained to use something very similar. The E-6B is actually really easy to use and very fast. You can solve many problems faster with an E-6B than by typing numbers into your iPad. So, while there are a lot of mathematical, let's say, issues for pilots to understand, the actual focus is on the understanding of the principles and use of charts, special slide rules like the E-6B, or electronics to solve the problem. As an example, here's a modern airplane in flight at 21,000 feet. You can see the airspeed pointer indicator showing 343 knots. It shows the speed via pointer and numerically. Behind the pointer is the barber pole, which represents the upper speed limit. The barber pole moves so that it will account for variations in temperature. Thus, at higher altitudes, shows the maximum Mach limit. The Mach number is also shown on this gauge, and in this case is 0.754. The airplane also calculates true airspeed, shown here at 474 knots, and factors in winds to give us ground speed of 469 knots. So in this case, the plane does the math. If the systems fail and the plane can't do the math, the pilots have an understanding of the principles involved to come up with alternative calculations that are going to be close enough to work and keep everybody on board safe. In the case of more basic airplanes, or back during World War II, pilots understood the principles and used the E-6B and a lot of charts. A great example is the Mach number chart we looked at. Now, the guy that made that chart was probably really good at traditional math. However, what the pilot needs to know is a bit different. The pilot needs to understand the relationship of Mach number, airspeed, altitude, and temperature, and be able to use the chart. A sharp pilot would have probably had various speeds from the chart memorized for use in an emergency, and he would know he'd have to alter the numbers a bit on days that are significantly warmer or colder than standard. My point is that pilot math is largely a case of understanding principles and using equipment, not literally working out math problems like you did back in high school. Until next time, farewell.